Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how I made this cosplay for Swansea from mouthwashing. Since this cosplay was a little bit of a last minute decision, and I also have minimal sewing skills, I started by buying a yellow polo shirt online, and I also bought a large spool of red bias tape to use for all of the detailing. I pinned the bias tape around the collar and both the sleeves, and this step was a little bit trickier than I thought it was going to be because I was not anticipating the shirt fabric to be so thick. But I got there eventually, and the shirt is already starting to look like a Pony Express uniform. Then it was time to start sewing, and I decided to hand sew all of these details. I wasn't sure if my machine was going to be able to handle all of these layers of fabric, and I also just didn't trust myself to sew straight lines with the machine, so I decided to sew it by hand. And since the layers of fabric were so thick and the bias tape was just a little bit trickier to sew than I thought it would be, I spaced this process out over the span of a few days. Once I was done hand sewing all of the bias tape onto the collar, I decided to start embroidering some details onto the shirt. This step was relatively easy. I just went over all of the pre-existing stitching with red embroidery thread so it would stand out a little bit more and look a little bit more like the shirt in the game. But I did make sure to take a lot of breaks during this step because once again, there were a lot of layers of fabric in certain parts and I didn't want to hurt my hands. In hindsight, I wish I was a little bit more mindful of where I started my embroidery and where I knotted my thread when I was done, and I will get a little bit more into that later. The buttons on the Pony Express uniform are red, which means that these white buttons that came with the shirt simply won't do, so I cut them off. And luckily, I already had red buttons in my house that were the correct size. There were little marks on the fabric where the buttons were previously, so I just used that as a guideline to sew on the new buttons. And now it's time for a little bit more embroidery. I was able to fix this mistake later, but this is where I wanted to be more mindful of where I was knotting my thread because Swansea wears this shirt unbuttoned and a lot of the knots were visible once I put this shirt on. That being said, the embroidery looked pretty good. It looked so good that I decided to add just a little bit more around the collar. Originally, I was going to put bias tape around this part of the collar, but I went with embroidery instead just because I thought it would look a little bit cleaner. And since that was everything I needed to do for the collar, it was time to move on to the sleeves. I'm grateful that this shirt is one size too big because the sleeves lost all stretch the moment I added the bias tape, which, don't get me wrong, is something that I was completely aware would happen. It's just something to keep in mind if you're planning on decorating a shirt in a similar way. It did make the sleeves a little bit more flattering, but I've been working out, so if my triceps were any bigger, we would have had a problem. And now it's finally time to add the Pony Express patch. This patch was from Clover Meadow Avenue on Etsy, and it's just a typical iron-on patch. I set my iron to the correct temperature for my fabric, ironed it on the front, flipped it inside out, ironed it on the back, and that's all there is to it. And that's how I made my Swansea cosplay. If you liked this video, please remember to like and subscribe so you can see more of my shenanigans, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!
You proud of me, Dad?